Hollywood often works on trends. Something proves to be popular, and numerous studios jump on the bandwagon trying to make their own version. That's why we get waves of disaster movies, slashers, J-horror remakes, found footage films, and currently superhero films. In the mid-1980s, it was clear the next big trend was going to be Peter Pan. Numerous studios were clamoring to make their version of the classic character. 20th Century Fox was making Rat Lightning, a Peter Pan story set in a dystopian city where Peter builds an army of homeless kids to help fight back against a James Bond-type villain. Neverland, a loose sequel to Peter Pan where he has to get modern kids to believe in him again in order to help save Neverland from Captain Hook, who somehow survived being eaten by a crocodile. Probably the highest profile of the Peter Pan films was a remake being helmed by Steven Spielberg. The remake was being written by Lawrence Lasker and Walter F. Parks, who were just coming off the very popular War Games, which was the 5th highest-grossing film of 1983. None of these films ended up going into production, although years later, in 1991, Spielberg ended up making the Peter Pan as an adult movie, Hook. Writers Jan Fisher and James Jeremias decided to take the Peter Pan story and give it a unique spin. They thought, what if Peter Pan was a vampire? Much like the original Peter Pan, their story centered around kids. The vampires were around 13, 14 years old. Peter's a vampire who seduces young kids to live in his underground lair, where, as vampires, they will never grow up. A team of younger kids made up of 5th and 6th grade school children were organizing to take down the vampires, joined by 2 chubby 8-year-old Cub Scouts called the Frog Brothers. Despite being about vampires, it was written as a family movie aimed for a G or PG rating. Another major change they made was it was all boys. The Wendy character from Peter Pan was removed and replaced with another character named Star. The script was called The Lost Boys, which was the name of Peter Pan's gang. In March of 1985, the duo sold their script to an independent production company for $400,000. It was then placed on the American film market and picked up by Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers hired Richard Franklin to direct. Franklin was an Australian director who started off doing exploitation movies like Patrick and Road Games. In the early 1980s, he began making films for Hollywood like Cloak and Dagger and Psycho 2. After some disputes about the production, Franklin left to make the horror film Link. They then hired Richard Donner to helm the production. Donner had just finished the kids' adventure film The Goonies, and he wanted to make The Lost Boys with a similar vibe. The studio even sold it to him as Goonies Go Vampire. Things were moving along slowly. The production kept getting delayed, and development was taking way longer than anyone expected. Donner started to lose interest in the production. He admitted that he has a problem where if he's attached to a product for too long without it being made, he loses his enthusiasm and starts to look for something else to do. He decided to move to directing Lethal Weapon, which was also being made by Warner Brothers, while still staying on this film as a producer. After Donner left, the studio brought in music video director Mary Lambert, but she exited over creative differences. Richard Donner was talking to his wife, producer Lauren Schuler Donner, who suggested they hire Joel Schumacher for the film. She had just produced Schumacher's 3rd film, St. Elmo's Fire, and said he was great. She thought the script for The Lost Boys sounded like something that would definitely be his style. Donner mentioned this to Mark Canton, the president of Warner Brothers, who arranged to have lunch with Schumacher. The two went to lunch, and Canton described the movie to Schumacher. Schumacher turned up his nose at the idea. Cub Scouts versus vampires? He wasn't feeling it. He asked, "Is this a little kid's vampire movie?" Somewhat annoyed at his response, Canton said, "Would you at least do me the courtesy of reading it?" Schumacher said sure, and they sent him a copy of the current script. It was like he feared, a vampire movie for kids. He considered doing it, but really, it wasn't the kind of movie that interested him. He just didn't feel he was the right director to do a kids movie. He called Donner and Canton to tell them he was going to pass on the project, but they were both out to lunch at the time. So while he waited for them to call back, he had some time alone with his own thoughts. There was a scene in the script where the kids were hanging underneath a train bridge. He really liked that. It was something he had never seen in a movie before. He thought about some of the other things within the script that he liked, but really felt that it was being held back by the ages of the characters. He wondered if they would be willing to let him change the characters' ages. A family-friendly kids vampire movie didn't interest him, but an R-rated vampire movie with older teenagers was more up his alley. Characters that were 17 and 18 instead of 12 and 13. When the producers called back, Schumacher had a different approach. He asked if they'd be willing to let him make some changes to the script, mainly the ages of the characters. They were open to his ideas, and after a meeting where he showed them some of his designs for the film, they hired him to direct. Schumacher brought in writer Jeff Bohm to rewrite the script. Bohm was the writer of the Stephen King adaptation The Dead Zone. He was also co-writing a screenplay that would go on to become Inner Space. On top of increasing the ages of the characters, Bohm wanted to add in some humor. The script followed a similar structure to the original, but was now updated. It was about a mother and her two sons moving to the town of Santa Cruz. While there, the oldest son is turned into a vampire, and the youngest joins with some local kid vampire hunters, the Frog Brothers, to try to stop the vampire menace. Schumacher took the script and added some of his own flair to it. He read up on vampire lore and wanted to make a film that stuck to the rules of vampires, while also bringing something fresh to the legend. He wanted to make a new take on a well-worn subject. Schumacher loved vampire fiction and wanted to do something original and fun without resorting to camp. They put things in the script that were taken from classic vampire lore. Garlic, crosses, no reflections in mirrors and such, but in a way that felt more modernized. Schumacher wanted an experienced cinematographer to do the film, and so he approached Michael Chapman. Chapman was the DP on Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, and the remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. What Schumacher didn't know was that Chapman loved horror movies and was overjoyed to be asked to shoot one, because with the kind of movies he was known for, no one ever offered. For the soundtrack, Schumacher wanted a melding of old with new. They hired Thomas Newman to write the film's score, which was a blending of orchestra and organ arrangements, which had the feel of the old vampire movies. As the counterpart to that, he decided to have the soundtrack loaded with cover tunes. They managed to get In Excess on the soundtrack, which was a big deal because they were really taken off at the time. The song they used was Good Times, which was a cover of the 1968 song by the Australian band The Easy Beats. When they signed In Excess for the soundtrack, Schumacher told them that he owed them a favor. Tim Capello, Tina Turner's touring saxophone player, did the song I Still Believe, which was a cover of the 1986 song by The Call. The Call were a band that formed in 1980 in Santa Cruz. Tim Capello was this giant muscle-bound guy with a saxophone, which was a look that Schumacher liked, so he had him perform the song in the movie. They also used Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me by Roger Daltrey, which was a cover of the 1974 song by Elton John. Schumacher said, out of all the classic monsters, vampires are the only ones that are sexy. When envisioning the Lost Boys, Schumacher saw them as being Doors fans. The Doors had a perfect combination of nihilism, sultry sexuality, and poetry. Jim Morrison was a musician who was haunted by death. All these things he thought would be embraced by a group of teenage vampires. The director called Ray Manzarek the keyboard player for The Doors. He knew Manzarek was producing the band Echo and the Bunnymen, and asked if he could get them to record a cover of People Are Strange, which he did. They also wanted to have some original songs in the film. Schumacher approached Lou Gramm from Foreigner to write and perform the theme song for The Lost Boys. He came up with Lost in the Shadows, which was the single they'd used to promote the movie. The other was Cry Little Sister by Gerard McMahon, which ended up becoming the theme for the film. They started casting and going down the list of people who Schumacher really wanted on the production. For the role of Lucy, the mother, Schumacher wanted one of his favorite actresses, Diane Wiest. Wiest had just won the Best Supporting Actress Oscar for Hannah and Her Sisters, so he figured there was no way she would agree to do this movie. Much to his delight and surprise, she accepted the role. For the role of Grandpa, they hired Shakespearean-trained actor Keenan Wynn. As filming got closer, Wynn had to drop out due to pancreatic cancer and died shortly thereafter. Next, they wanted John Carradine, but he was far too sick at the time to be able to handle the demands of the role. They ended up casting Bernard Hughes, who they wanted initially, but didn't think he'd take the role if they offered. Donner directed The Goonies with Corey Feldman. While The Lost Boys was casting, he called Feldman and told him to come meet with the director. He brought him in and met Schumacher, who hired him for the role of Edgar Frog. They hired Jamison Newlander for Alan Frog. Schumacher saw actor Corey Haim in the drama Lucas, and hired him for the role of Sam on the strength of his performance in that. The director saw numerous auditions for the role of the oldest brother Michael, but there was only one actor he wanted, Jason Patric. Patrick was the only actor in the age range that had the looks as well as the talent to carry the part. As a plus, he also had a slight resemblance to Jim Morrison. Schumacher met with the actor, who turned the role down. He He was afraid it would be an exploitation movie, and that wasn't the direction he wanted to go with for his career. The director repeatedly asked him, but he kept turning it down. Over the next 6 weeks, he had numerous meetings with the actor and his agent, trying to convince him that this wouldn't be the movie that he thought it was. He promised him this wasn't an exploitation horror film, and they weren't even planning on using vampire makeup for his part. Finally, after weeks of negotiating, he agreed to do the part. Schumacher was having a hard time casting the part of Star. In the script, she was this weird girl that Michael felt bad for. She was envisioned as a hippie waif with a blonde pixie haircut, kind of like a young Meg Ryan. None of the actresses he saw felt right for the part. Jason Patric then suggested he meet with actress Jamie Gertz. He had just worked with her on the sci-fi movie Solar Babies. Initially, Schumacher didn't want to meet her because she was so different from how the character was written. However, he took the actor at his word and met the actress. He immediately agreed and changed the role of Star to match the actress. Seeing the chemistry between the two, they wrote the character to now be his love interest. The director saw actor Edward Herrmann on stage in New York. He wanted him for the character of Max because he was such a nice guy. No one would suspect him being the head vampire. Herrmann took the job because it was one of the few times he was offered a role that wasn't something like a historical drama. Finally, he could play a villain in a horror movie. Schumacher was watching the 1986 film at close range. Towards the end of the movie, there was a close-up shot of an actor who he didn't recognize. It was actor Kiefer Sutherland, and while he was in the movie, almost all of his scenes had been cut. The director knew there was something about the actor, and he wanted to meet him. Kiefer was the son of actors Shirley Douglas and Donald Sutherland. He had just finished filming the drama Stand By Me, and Schumacher was very impressed by him. He hired him to play the lead vampire David, which was the Peter Pan role. The director wanted handsome, distinct-looking young actors for the other Lost Boys. He hired Billy Wirth, a male model, to play Dwayne, Brooke McCarter to play Paul, and Alex Winter to play Marco. The studio wasn't happy with the director's casting. They said they had never heard of most of these people. Why would anyone go see a movie with actors they didn't know? They wanted the film to have some better names attached, but the director refused. He was very happy with his cast, and he knew they'd give the performance he wanted. Having a known actor would just take the focus away from the other characters. The budget at the time was rumored to be close to $20 million. At the last minute, the studio took a big chunk of money away and told the director, "If you want to make this movie with a bunch of nobodies, you'll have to make it for less money." They cut the film from $20 million to $8.5. Instead of giving in and recasting, which was what the studio wanted, the director moved ahead with the production. Schumacher hired costume designer Susan Becker, who he worked with on St. Elmo's Fire. As a way to meld the old with the new, she used clothing from various eras, like a Victorian bellboy's jacket for Laddie, the youngest vampire, and 1950s motorcycle gear for the Lost Boys. While looking for filming locations, they went with where the script took place, Santa Cruz, California. They also planned for some things in LA, as well as some sets on the Warner Brothers lot. Santa Cruz was famous for its boardwalk, which they wanted to use for many of the scenes in the film. Although there was another reason. In the 1970s, Santa Cruz ended up becoming the home of 3 serial killers: John Linley Frazier, Edmund Kemper, and Herbert Mullen. In the period between 1972 and 1973, they brutally killed 25 people. Because of this, Santa Cruz became known as the murder capital of the world. The writers took this and used it in the script, although making it seem that it was this way because of the vampires. The officials of Santa Cruz didn't like this. They were desperately trying to shake the name they were given and told the production they couldn't use the location if they kept calling it the murder capital of the world. They'd been trying to attract families to their beaches and boardwalks, so if a major movie came out calling this place the murder capital of the world, it would scare off tourists. They changed the name in the script to Santa Carla, which was good enough for the Santa Cruz people. For Grandpa's lodge-style house, the exteriors were the Pogo Nip Country Club. The interiors were a set on the Warner Brothers soundstage. The exteriors for the cave where the Lost Boys lived was located on Mainland Park in Ranchos Palos Verdes, California, about 400 miles south of Santa Cruz. To get the shot of the vampires going into the cave, they flew a helicopter up to the entrance, and then switched it to a camera flying through the set on the soundstage. The sunken hotel the Lost Boys lived in was based on the Valencia Street Hotel, which collapsed during an earthquake in April of 1906. Joel Schumacher wanted all the vampires to have long hair, but Sutherland didn't like the way his looked. He had it dyed white, which he didn't like. He thought it made him look like a wrestler. He was trying to figure out what to do when he saw Billy Idol's first solo record. When he went to the stylist before filming, he told them to cut the top and sides short, but keep the rest long. He liked the look, but Schumacher wasn't happy. He eventually got over it, though. Kiefer apologized because he said he may have accidentally created the mullet. Filming began in April of 1986. Since they didn't have very much in the budget for special effects, they had to get creative. To show the vampires flying, they had many scenes they filmed with a crane, giving the vampire POV. Driving the motorcycles on the sand was very dangerous. For some of the shots, it was the actors, and for the others, the more dangerous ones, they had stunt people. Even though it was dangerous, they were allowed to shoot the sequence without helmets, something that wouldn't be allowed today. Kiefer Sutherland already knew how to ride a motorcycle, so he didn't have to be trained. Although he was doing a stunt and ended up breaking his wrist. To cover this up, he wore black leather gloves for the rest of the movie to hide his injury. For the train bridge sequence, they used the Iron Horse Trailhead Bridge in Valencia, California. The bridge wasn't that high off the ground, so they filled the area with smoke to give the illusion of it being much higher. The actors were hanging, but it was only a few feet drop to the ground. They also built a replica of the underside of the bridge on one of the sound stages, which they also filled with smoke. They had the actors wired in harnesses at the top of the soundstage, but used stuntmen for the drop. The comic store is Atlantis Fantasy World, a real shop in Santa Cruz. The owners of the shop had a cameo in the background of one of the scenes. The Vampires Everywhere comic was made specifically for the movie, and only a few prop copies existed at the time. When talking to the Frog Brothers, the director told them to play their parts as serious as possible. He told them to play their characters like they were Marines. He had them watch numerous action movies from Stallone and Chuck Norris, and told them to use that as inspiration. Nanook was 2 Alaskan Malamutes. They were both well trained, but one was the friendly, lovable one, and the other was for the more aggressive shots. The scene where the vampires mess with Michael over the Chinese food was a concept that writer Jeff Bohm came up with. Each time Michael would look in the containers, it would be something disgusting. They had to hire a maggot wrangler to come in and oversee the maggot use in the film. They had a box of maggots, and in order to get them to move, they had to squeeze lemon juice on them. They also had to hire a worm wrangler to come in and oversee the worm use in the film. They had a box of worms, and in order to get them to move, they also had to squeeze lemon juice on them. To make David stand out even more in this scene, he was lit separately from the other actors. They had one specific light shining on only him the entire time. Since there were kids in the movie, they had to be careful with their time. They only had a limited amount they could use them each day. Jason and Corey became friends, which really helped with the bonding aspect of the film. You felt like they were real brothers. There was a scene later on in the film that called for flies. For that, they needed, you guessed it, a fly wrangler. He released roughly 300,000 flies, which they discovered you can't even see on film. They tried to recapture them, but they escaped and went into other sets on the soundstage. Understandably, this upset the other people that were working there. Every time you turned a light on, it was covered in flies, and they started showing up in the dailies. They had to bring in several exterminators to clear out the infested sets. In the end, for the scene, they had the actors flail around a little and added the fly sounds in post. They wish they would have known that in the beginning. It would have saved a lot of headaches. Part of the way through filming, the studio was getting nervous. The executives at the studio had no idea what this movie was. They were looking at the dailies and asked Mark Canton to talk to the director. Canton met with Schumacher and asked, "The CEOs have been looking at the dailies and are asking if you're making a horror movie or a comedy." Schumacher said, "Tell them, yes." Canton spoke to the powers that be and returned to tell them, "They don't think those two genres will work together. They said you can either scare people or make them laugh. You can't do both." The director said, "Well, go back and tell them to pray." Canton was getting worried that the executives were going to have the director replaced. They just didn't understand what he was doing. As filming progressed, the director realized he was, in fact, going to need vampire makeup. Although he didn't want to go the traditional route, he wanted to make them unique. They held meetings over what the vampires looked like, and the director didn't want to bog them down with too many prosthetics. They were working on a limited budget, and couldn't go overboard with these effects anyway. Although they were in a rush, they had someone on board, but he just wasn't making what the director wanted. They needed an expert. They contacted Greg Canham, who trained under Rick Baker. He worked on many makeup effects heavy films like The Fury and The Incredible Melting Man. At first, he wasn't too interested in the film, since the last vampire movie he worked on was a mess. He had just finished working on Vamp with Grace Jones. Apparently, working on that film was a nightmare because nobody on there had worked with makeup effects before, but that's a story for another time. Canham changed his mind after seeing what they were doing on The Lost Boys. The passion seeped out of the production, and he could tell this had the potential to be something special. Still, he couldn't believe they were halfway through filming a movie about vampires and didn't have any set makeup design. Since filming had already begun, there was no time for pre-production. Canham was creating stuff on the fly as per the director's instructions. He wanted to show as much of the actors' faces as possible. They had all these handsome young actors. The director didn't want them to look like monsters. He wanted something different. The first test was a very exaggerated face, not at all what he was looking for. Canham then drew inspiration for the look of the vampires from the strangest place, an old photo of a tennis player. He had this photo for about 10 years, and there was something about it that was interesting. It had faded over the years, and he used this as a reference. He went back and gave the vampires a very streamlined, sleek look. It wasn't exactly as the director envisioned, but it was close enough. Plus, they were in a hurry and couldn't delay the makeup effects scenes any longer. They were in a rush, and Schumacher approved almost all the initial makeup tests. There were just a few things he asked the artist to refine or alter. Since the changes to the actors' faces was subtle, Canham wanted to make something that made them stand out when they changed. Something to draw attention away from the face. He painted hard contact lenses, which made the vampires look frightening. When we see the vampires in full vamp mode for the first time, is when they kill a group of surfers. This was really tricky to do since it wasn't until an hour into the movie. Canham credits the look of the vampires to the DP, Michael Chapman, who lit them in a way that made them look excellent, despite how quickly they were created. Keeping with the theme of using cover tunes, the director choreographed the scene to Walk This Way by Run DMC and Aerosmith. He thought it would be something interesting and unique to have an action sequence set to a rap song. When David attacked the surfers, they had a shot where he was chewing on the back of one of their heads. They made this stuff that was essentially like cake that he was eating, which made it look like he was devouring the back of the bald guy's skull. They ended up cutting the scene because they thought it might be too much and they wouldn't get their R rating. While it was easy to make the boys look evil, they had a problem with Ed Herman because he's so friendly looking. They continued to tweak his appearance, but focused on the scenes they needed to shoot right now. One of the things they wanted to do to reinvent the vampire was to have it so they weren't sleeping in coffins. They took the liberty with the story and made a section of the cave into a giant coffin. Canham created prosthetic feet for the vampires, which worked like hands so they could hang from the ceiling like bats. When they staked Marco, they wanted the blood to really catch the light, so the effects guys put glitter in the blood, which helped it reflect and make it look unearthly. The stake they used was a collapsible prop. You can see the stake is solid here, but then it has sections here. The contact lenses the actors used were uncomfortable. They were hard lenses, so no air got to your eyes. They could only wear them for about 3 or 4 minutes at a time. This meant from the second you put them on, your eyes would start drying out. They also had the nasty tendency to get dirt and dust particles stuck behind them, which made them hurt more. So the actors didn't enjoy wearing them. In the scene where David gets burned by the sun, he backs off and sheds a tear. In the movie, it looks like this was planned, to show how much that hurt. But in reality, the actor's eye was tearing because of the lens. It looked so good, the director kept it in the movie. They need to shoot a scene where the boys go into a church to get some holy water for the fight against the vampires. Understandably, no church would let them do this, so they built a small church set back at Warner Brothers for the scene. Almost all the effects were done in camera. They only had 2 blue screen shots. One where Sam gets picked up, and the other when David and Michael clash mid-air. They were the only 2 they could afford. DreamQuest Images handled many of the film's special effects, including the blue screen work. They also handled some of the pyrotechnics. For example, the scene where Sam shoots the vampire into the stereo. This very short sequence took 2 weeks to design and stage. Canham did the makeup, and DreamQuest handled the explosions. When Schumacher was negotiating with Jason Patric, he promised him he would never have to wear vampire makeup. Now that they were near the end of filming, the director realized he was going to have to break that promise. Towards the end, Michael kills David, And since that was his first kill, he's now a full vampire. It wouldn't make sense if he didn't transform. He almost turns earlier, but for that scene, he's only wearing the contacts. The director told Patrick, who was very upset. He said he was sorry, but they had to do it for the story. He did the scene, but didn't talk to the director for a few days. Schumacher wanted a full shot of David going into the horns, so they designed a large-scale puppet. They did all this work, but because of how it was edited, we never see the puppet. When David died, he asked the actor to shave because he looked so much younger without the beard. For the grand finale, Max gets knocked into the fireplace. They filmed a segment where it showed Max aging until finally exploding in the fireplace and covering everyone in black soot. They built a full-size puppet of the actor that they could move around before it exploded. There were 3 stages made for the sequence. It started with his current age, and then the makeup goes all the way up to 300 years old. Max falls back into the fireplace, which starts to ooze blood before exploding into a cloud of smoke. They decided to trim the scene down to where it just goes from him getting knocked into the fireplace and then exploding. Ultimately, it was cut for time. Although Cannon was sad because no one would see the really good full-blown Max vampire they worked so hard on. The director regretted wanting smoke because it got everywhere. He said working in it was like being trapped in a coal mine. The film had numerous references and in-jokes. The vampire cave had this giant picture of Jim Morrison as the person the vampires idolized. In the video store, you can clearly see the Goonies. In Sam's room is a poster of Echo and the Bunnymen. Also in Sam's room is a poster of Rob Lowe. Lowe had just starred in Schumacher's last movie, St. Elmo's Fire. The name of the mother, Lucy, was a reference to the character from Bram Stoker's Dracula. In March of 1987, Richard Donner's Lethal Weapon was released a few months before The Lost Boys. There's a scene where Murtaugh and Riggs are walking down the street, and you can see a movie theater's marquee that reads, Lost Boys, this year's hit. They finished filming and moved into post. The director worked with editor Robert Brown and noticed something was missing. When the kids go back to the house to fortify it for the vampire attack, we never see the vampires leave their cave. They just show up. For the sake of continuity, they needed that little insert. They were running out of money, so they had to be frugal and fake it with clever editing. They went back to the cave set and used the vampire feet to show them leaping off the ceiling. Then, with a mix of footage they had already shot, like the vampires sleeping from earlier, they showed them leaving the cave. The shot of them outside the cave was the same one from earlier of them entering the cave. It's just shown in reverse. You can tell because the water's moving backwards. After the film was complete, the director put together his cut. The studio, still nervous, held a research screening in Long Beach, California. There was a positive buzz around the film, and over 700 people showed up for the screening. The crowd absolutely loved the movie. They were laughing at the jokes and screaming at the scary parts. The director was happy because he didn't expect the jokes to land as well as they did. In fact, some of them landed so well, the audience was laughing and missed some of the follow-up jokes. At the end, when Max looks into the room where David was killed, people in the audience thought Grandpa was going to be the head vampire. This made the director happy because it meant his fake-out with Max worked. Seeing the audience reaction, the executives were now happy. They proceeded to act like they knew how this movie was going to be this whole time. Watching the audience reactions helped the director to know what to work on for his next edit. He extended some scenes to give the comedy room to breathe. The biggest was when Sam kills Dwayne. The audience was cheering, and they missed Corey Haim's one-liner. So he went back and extended some of the shots so that audiences would now be quiet when Haim delivers
Death by stereo.
The movie opened on July 31st, 1987 in second place. It might have opened in first, but unfortunately they chose to open it up against a James Bond film, The Living Daylights. It did, however, stay in theaters for 22 weeks and grossed over $30 million domestically. It was one of Warner Brothers' most profitable films that year. Critical reception was mostly good, but some had problems. Roger Ebert in his review said, "There's some good stuff in the movie, but when everything's all over, there's nothing to leave the theater with. No real horrors, no real dread, no real imagination. Just technique at the service of formula." Most audiences love the film. It currently sits at number 14 of the top 25 best-reviewed vampire movies. The movie was a major hit on home video, and the soundtrack sold very well. After the film was a success, Santa Cruz started using it to promote the town as a tourist destination. They had screenings of the movie every year on the anniversary of its release. After the success of The Lost Boys, Warner Brothers wanted to have the director do a sequel. He instead suggested a prequel called Lost Boys: The Beginning. It was about how David and the boys became vampires, all set in the early 1900s around the San Francisco earthquake. The script was written by Eric Red, who just wrote another vampire film, Near Dark. Sutherland was even on board, and was surprised when the studio decided not to do it. The Atlantic Fantasy World comic book store was destroyed in the earthquake of 1989. They moved to Cedar Street in Santa Cruz and are still open to this day. The owners have a copy of the Vampires Everywhere comic, and customers can come in to see it and get a picture. A few months after the film, the band In Excess called in their favor to Schumacher and asked him to direct their music video, Devil Inside. After The Lost Boys, the Coreys became a thing. Numerous films like License to Drive, Dream a Little Dream 1 and 2, and Last Resort were released as Corey movies, where the two actors were sold as a duo. They even did the teen sex thriller Blown Away, where Nicole Eggert did something that, to my knowledge, has never been done before or since. She had sex with both Coreys in the same movie. The success of The Lost Boys opened a lot of doors for Schumacher. He said many of the jobs he was offered were from producers who were fans of the movie. He went on to direct a wide variety of films like Flatliners, Falling Down, A Time to Kill, and Batman Forever. He also directed Batman and Robin, which he's since apologized for. Although right now there's a petition for a release of the director's cut for Batman Forever, which I honestly would like to see. He said he would have loved to have done another vampire movie, but no one ever brought him a script he felt would be worth it. The scripts he was presented with were all creatively bankrupt. In 1998, Schumacher dropped the prequel idea and tried to do a direct sequel, but Warner Brothers wasn't interested. Then in 2001, Schumacher was set to produce a sequel based on his own idea called The Lost Girls, with someone else directing. He had meetings with Warner Brothers, but they passed on his ideas. In 2007, he said, "I told them to do Lost Girls and not do a Lost Boys sequel. There is no Lost Boys sequel. All the boys are dead. The Coreys are too old, so what would be the movie? You'd have to make up a whole new set of characters. Do gorgeous teenage biker chicks who are vampires. It'll be great." But they don't listen to me. Schumacher later said the character of David was intended to return in a follow-up after not exactly dying at the end of the original movie. His story ended up continuing in the comic The Lost Boys: Reign of Frogs. There was another comic miniseries released in 2016 simply called The Lost Boys that acts as the sequel to the movie that we never got. Richard Donner wanted to make a Frog Brothers spin-off where they were now running a vampire hunting business. His version never happened. In 2008, Warner Brothers released the low-budget spin-off about Edgar Frog called Lost Boys: The Tribe. Jamison Newlander was also back as Alan Frog, but his scenes were edited out of the film for some reason. In 2010, Edgar and Alan are fully reunited in Lost Boys: The Thirst. This really annoyed Schumacher because he felt it was just wasting the series' potential. Corey Haim had a cameo in The Tribe, but turned down doing anything more. He later agreed to have a larger role in the third spin-off if they ever made one. Sadly, Haim died in early 2010 at the way too young age of 38. In an interview, Kiefer Sutherland was asked why he wasn't in the Lost Boys sequels. He said, "Lost Boys was a massive part of my life. It still is. And I'm not going to go out and do a cameo in a DVD release sequel." He also lamented the fact that they never let Schumacher direct any of his ideas. In 2016, The Lost Boys was set to be turned into a series for the CW. They were planning on shooting a pilot directed by Catherine Hardwicke, who directed the first Twilight movie. It was a retelling of the original movie, with added plot points to stretch it into a full season. They also planned on having the Frog Brothers gender swapped to be the Frog Sisters. They shot 2 pilots, but as of 2021, neither were picked up by the CW. Although it's rumored they're planning on attempting a 3rd pilot. Although it's possible the pilots were passed on, because Warner Brothers is now moving ahead with a reboot, directed by Jonathan Entwistle, who did the Netflix series I Am Not Okay With This. They already cast Noah Jupe from A Quiet Place, and Jaden Martell from It. Not sure if they're supposed to be Sam and Michael or the Frog Brothers. The original Lost Boys inspired the modern vampire fiction that followed. Mostly before, vampires were all gothic, and many of the vampire movies took places in castles, like the Hammer horror films. The look of the younger, more hip vampires were directly inspired by the Lost Boys. For better or worse, it's what led to the overwhelming amount of young adult vampire fiction. There's also been plenty of homages over the years. In Buffy the Vampire Slayer, they use the term vamp out, which was coined by Edgar Frog.
If you try to stop us or vamp out in any way, then I'll stake you without even thinking twice about it.
Joss Whedon admitted that David was the inspiration for Spike. In the 2014 film What We Do in the Shadows, David transforms noodles into worms. The music video for Into the Summer by Incubus is an homage to the movie. The song The Lost Boys by the 69 Eyes. The band Lizzie Borden had a song called Be One of Us, which was inspired by the movie. The band Gunship did a music video called Dark All Day, which not only references the movie, but was done in collaboration with Tim Capello. In 2019, there was the biggest Lost Boys reunion ever, which included Kiefer Sutherland, Jason Patric, Alex Winter, Jamison Newlander, Chance Michael Corbett, and Billy Wirth, along with musicians from the film, Gerard McMahon and Tim Capello. This was the first time they had all been together in 30 years. While I was working on the video, I was stunned to see how many people involved with the movie are no longer with us. I mentioned Corey Haim, but also Brooke McCarter, Edward Herman, Bernard Hughes, Jan Fisher, Jeff Boehm, Harvey Bernard, Michael Chapman, Marion Doherty, Richard Donner, and Joel Schumacher. Schumacher died in 2020 after he lost his fight with cancer. The Lost Boys is one of the all-time best vampire movies. It's funny to think that if Donner wasn't out to lunch, The Lost Boys as we know it wouldn't exist. It most likely would have been a weird vampire kids movie that no one really remembers anymore. Instead, we get a film that fires on all cylinders. Everything in the film works, from the directing to the cast to the script. It feels timeless, probably because it's a story that's timeless. A new kid in town is attracted to a girl and wants to belong, but ends up in a very dangerous situation that puts his family at risk. Also, vampires. I've loved the movie ever since I first saw it. It's fun, funny, good-looking, and has a great soundtrack. It's sad Schumacher never was able to make The Lost Girls. I think if he did that in the 90s, it may not have been as huge as the original, but it certainly would have been better than the direct-to-video spin-offs. Also, I'm not too excited about the possible reboot. The Lost Boys is one of those movies that has endured in its popularity this long for a reason. Trying to recapture that magic is destined to fail. Just go back and watch the original. There is nothing here that needs updating or fixing. It's perfect the way it is.
Boy, somebody around here has bad breath. No, would you quit breathing on me?
No, get upstairs. Go on.